The Great Lakes Church of God presents Mr. John J. Blanchard. The title of today's message is Food and Our Fellow Man, recorded on January 26, 2017.
All right, well, welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to come out. I hope you find this seminar interesting, but also very useful. I hope it is useful in your life. The title of the seminar is Food and Your Fellow Man. I think it's very important for the times in which we live. But before I get into the seminar, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm born and raised 64 years ago, born in Detroit. Moved to the UP of Michigan. And if you're not from Michigan, you probably don't know what UP stands for, or Uper. If you live in the UP, you're a Uper. That's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Michigan is often portrayed as a mitten, like this. And everybody thinks of Detroit when they think of Michigan. Well, that's where I was born, down here. But there's another mitten that goes up here, okay, and that's the Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula, Upper Peninsula, connected by the Mackinac Bridge. Well, I live in the UP. I've lived there for 42 years now. And I moved there with my wife pretty much right out of high school because I had read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, that was written in the early 60s. And in high school, I was a debater, and on a debate topic when I was a senior was pollution. And I became very concerned about herbicides and pesticides. So when my wife and I decided we were going to have children, so let's move where the air is clean, the water is pure, and we can raise healthy children. So that's how we ended up in the UP. Been there, like I said, for quite some time now. And we have a farm. On that farm, I raise grass-fed Texas Longhorn beef. We raise a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. We have apple trees, plum trees, pear trees, and all the vegetables and everything we raise are without chemicals. So that was how we started. We got into cattle, raising different breeds, and settled in 1990 on the Longhorn breed because we figured they hadn't been messed around with. They're basically the way cattle were brought to North America, I think, by Christopher Columbus a long time ago. So we settled for that breed. They're very lean, very healthy, very vigorous, and been doing it ever since. Well, little did we know what would happen to agriculture and how it would change, that it's far worse than just dealing with herbicides and pesticides. So that's what's led to this seminar. Now, over that course of 40 years, I've made my predominant living in construction as a contractor. So as a contractor and a small farmer, I spent a great deal of time outside. Then about 20 years ago, I became an elder in our church and eventually a pastor of a small congregation. So now I've got outdoor experience in construction, experience in farming, and putting my nose in the Bible all the time. And that led to some serious study about what we're doing to God's creation and what we're doing to each other. And that's how I ended up with this seminar today. Now, when you look at all this material, I want you to know we're going to go through it fairly quickly. It looks like I could be here all night. In actual fact, this subject is so deep we could. But I'll give you some of the highlights of this subject, and then you can study it further on your own, or stay in contact with us, because hopefully we'll have more presentations to come along. First of all, I want to give you the big picture. The big picture of where we stand today in our dealings with the earth as stewards of God's earth. I've got a number of articles I'll quote from, and I will quote extensively from other sources today because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but I have a lot of experience hands-on. But I took the scientific facts to support what I could see anecdotally around me and what you could see by talking to people who are getting sick with all sorts of strange ailments today. So I got a series of articles here I'd like to quote from. The first one is the USA Today from October 28, 2016, very recent article. Wildlife populations around the world have declined by more than half since the 1970s, a new environmental report says. The numbers of mammals, birds, and fish fell an average of 58% from 1970 to 2012. The World Wildlife Federation and the Zoological Society of London said in the Living Planet report published this past Thursday. Wildlife populations could decline by 67% compared with 1970 by the end of the decade if nothing is done, the report said. For decades, scientists have been warning that human actions are pushing life on our shared planet toward a sixth mass extinction. We're feeling the impact of a sick planet, all increasingly suffering from environmental degradation. We've got a sick planet. That's what the studies are showing. Our wildlife are disappearing at an alarming rate. Can you imagine 67% of the wildlife disappearing from 1970 to 2020? Because that's what that article concluded, by 2020. That's alarming. I think most people are realizing our bumblebees are in trouble. And our bats, by the way, which are two of our main pollinators. This is from the USA Today, a more recent article even, January 11th, 2017. The title of the article is Buzzkill, Bumblebee Listed as Endangered for the First Time. Dramatic decline in numbers is a risk to food supply and ecology. A bumblebee is now on the endangered species list for the first time in a race against extinction, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced Tuesday. The agency placed the rusty-patched bumblebee on the list because of a dramatic population decline over the past 20 years. Since the late 1990s, the population of this species has plummeted 87%. We depend on bees to pollinate our crops. The next article I want to quote, and I don't have it with me, is the January 19, 2017 issue of USA Today, in which there's a primate study that indicates primates, of course we're primates, but primates other than human beings are disappearing at an alarming rate around the world. Some so threatened they're down just to a few breeding pairs. The New York Times in 2012 published an article entitled, "Are We in the Midst of the Sixth Mass Extinction?" And it goes through various species of animals here and how much they are endangered. I just want to read one paragraph from here, two paragraphs actually. Nearly 20,000 species of animals and plants around the globe are considered high risks for extinction in the wild. That's according to the most authoritative compilation of living things at risk, the so-called Red List, maintained by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We know from the fossil record that such rapid loss of so many species has previously occurred only 5 times in the past 540 million years. The last mass extinction around 65 million years ago wiped out the dinosaur. Those are powerful words, the sixth mass extinction. Anecdotally, I can tell you that when my wife and I moved to the UP in the mid-70s, we moved in the spring, and we moved from Detroit. So Detroit, of course, doesn't have much wildlife. We moved in a very pristine area, surrounded by forest and fields. And because we moved there in the spring, we were astounded that early in the morning, the songbirds were so loud, they hurt our ears. During the day, when it was the butterfly season, you couldn't drive the car up and down the roads without hitting monarch butterflies, no matter how hard you tried not to hit them. There were thousands upon thousands of monarch butterflies. And in the springtime at night, the frogs were deafening. We have 2 frog ponds on our farm. You couldn't even hardly walk anywhere near them. It would hurt your ears. And to shut the noise down, you could close all the windows in the house. It didn't matter. The sound would penetrate right through the walls. Come up to our time today. You hear a bird here, bird there, a few in a flock chirp, And at night, you'll hear a few frogs in the lower pond croak to a few frogs in the upper pond. What is going on? Now, that's anecdotally. The young people who are here today think that what they're seeing here outside is normal because they've never experienced that. Just like we could never, in my generation, say, must be awesome to watch the buffalo go by and it takes 3-4 days for the herd to go by. Herds that were 25 miles long, or 25 miles wide, I should say, and 50 miles long. Some of the herds, there were 3 main herds in the United States, had 60 million buffalo. Well, we can't experience that anymore. But our young people today have no idea what it was that we heard when we were younger. And it's only getting worse. And according to the reports we just read, we're headed toward a 6th mass extinction. Now, why is our planet so sick? I may surprise you by saying it's not global warming. And I'm not saying that global warming is not occurring. Of course, global warming is occurring. But global warming has taken place maybe hundreds of thousands of times over the 540 million years. We don't know how many times it occurred. But the Earth has always had the capacity to right itself. You see, whether there was a mass extinction because of an asteroid, meteorite, ice age, whatever it was, the Earth had the capacity to fix itself. Now what we're dealing with is a mass extinction caused by a single species, human beings, who've so dominated the planet, so controlled everything, that they're killing everything else off. The problem is, we're going to be the last to go. We can't exist on an Earth without the rest of the living things. It's not going to happen. So I'm not concerned so much that global warming is doing terrible things to us. We can't really totally control that. Part of it is a cycle, part of it is some of what we're doing. But the chemicals that we are spewing into our environment, that we are making, we are in total control over. And we use it with abandon on our crops, in our fields, in our forests. And it's sickening our wildlife, and it's sickening us. As a matter of fact, the sun's rays, I think, are very important. When the Earth is sick, it's like a human being. This is me talking, not as a scientist, just me talking. When you get sick and you get an infection, you get a fever, don't you? And doctors realize a fever helps you cure yourself of the disease because it destroys the bacterium, it destroys the viruses. It helps your body actually fight off the disease. Well, the sun's rays, when it gets hot, destroy the bad chemicals we're putting into the environment. They also destroy the funguses and the bacteria that are thriving because of the things we have put out of balance. The sun's rays, they have found, is the only thing that will positively kill the prions that cause mad cow disease. Did you know that? You can't even burn the prions that cause mad cow disease at 2,000 degrees. That will not kill them because they're a living, non-living thing. But the sunlight, the natural sunlight, can break it down. In some cases, it can take up to 10 years on a field that's full of prions. Because, see, when animals give birth, if they're sick with mad cow disease, the grass that they give birth on has the prions on the grass. And they found that they can scoop that grass up and burn it, test it, still has prions. But leave it out there, in about 5 or 6 years, it's dramatically down. Within 10 years, it's totally gone from the sun. So I just came up with this idea that, you know, the sun isn't all bad when it warms things up. As a matter of fact, we've ruined most of our good farmland today. And as the earth gets warmer and tries to compensate for the carbon, the plants are getting bigger. Studies have shown that our maple leaves up north are up to 20% bigger than they were in the 1950s. More grass appears as the ice recedes in the far north. And what does that do? Open more farmland that's not yet polluted. So we could use that farmland to replace the farmland I feel we've got to get rid of until it's cleaned of the chemicals we put on it. So we may actually need some global warming. But that's just me talking. But you see, global warming does not produce cancer. It does not produce autism. It does not produce autoimmune disease. It doesn't do that. It does not produce diabetes or heart disease. Global warming does none of those things. We do it. We do it to ourselves with the chemicals, the herbicides and the pesticides that we produce and spray with abandon on our land. Human abuse of creation is the source of our problems. We are breaking physical and spiritual laws, and we are literally reaping what we sow. We are reaping what we've sown 30 and 40 years ago, and it's getting worse. The sixth mass extinction is unlike anything that's ever happened before. It's totally man-caused. And the natural systems of the earth don't know how to deal with it. They've known what to do. The natural systems God created knew what to do. When there's too much carbon in earth, the plants get bigger. Not enough carbon, the plants get smaller. A volcano explodes and there's dust in the air, the winds clean it up and the rains. But when you use chemicals and you change the actual nature of things and you change and destroy the soil, it can be irreversible in some cases. It can, like the bumblebee and the bat. The bat is dying from a fungus disease. The bats are, we used to see hundreds of bats in the UP. I haven't seen a bat in the last several years. They're getting a fungus. Now, no one knows exactly why that fungus is occurring, but we do know that when you use pesticides and herbicides, fungus accumulates in plants. So maybe there's a connection. But anyway, 6,000 years ago, there was a farmer by the name of Cain who asked his creator, "Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper?" And I think anybody involved with agriculture today or agri-science needs to ask themselves, am I my brother's keeper? And I think we all know the answer, yes, we are. So 6,000 years ago, Cain asked that question. 3,500 years ago, the same creator that he was talking to, that Cain had talked to, said, "Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder." It's one of the 10 Commandments. 2,000 years ago, that same creator came to this earth and he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Now those are powerful words. We keep getting repeated to us by our Creator. But are we tone deaf? Are we not listening? The body of this seminar is divided into 3 parts. I hope to have enough time to get through all 3. First part's going to be pesticides and herbicides. The second part will be GMOs, which is genetically modified organisms. The third part will be antibiotics, hormones, and endocrine disruptors. Then we'll conclude the seminar, and I'd like to open it up to questions. So that gives you an idea what the format is. Don't be intimidated by all these. I think we'll have enough time. I just have it organized in such a way that we can have it section by section. Pesticides and herbicides. You know, producing food has always been hard. Dealing with pests, dealing with weeds, dealing with drought, too much rain sometimes, it's never been easy. But the 20th century brought us agri-science. And agri-science came up with wonderful concoctions called herbicides and pesticides. The World Book defines this for us. I made a copy here, World Book Encyclopedia. Of pesticides. Pesticides are classified according to the pests they control. The 4 main types of pesticides are herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, and insecticides. The effects of pesticides use. pests may develop resistance to pesticides so that higher dosages must be used over time. Eventually, pesticides can become ineffective, so there's a constant need to create new pesticides. Over 600 species of plant and animal pests have been found to be resistant to at least one pesticide. Pesticides are poisons that can have unintended effects on people and on the environment. Wind or rain can carry herbicides from weeds to desirable plant species, such as trees and flowers. Insecticides kill beneficial insects, such as honeybees and ladybugs. Health officials worry about small amounts of pesticides that remain on food. Most people and many animals have pesticide traces in their fat tissue. As a matter of fact, I heard of one study recently that tested the fat tissue of 30,000 Americans and found pesticides and herbicides in every one of them. So it's in us. It's in us. It's there. Going on with the article here. People used chemical pesticides for many years without realizing their harmful effects on humans and the environment. In 1962, American marine biologist Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring to call public attention to pesticide dangers, and the book helped reduce pesticide use throughout the world. Well, that effect is worn off. There's more pesticides getting used than ever. But that was the book that you could say helped change my life. It had a big impact in the 60s and 70s on people who were concerned about the environment and the use of these chemicals. Well, the seemingly perfect herbicide was invented in the 1970s. That herbicide is called glyphosate. Has anybody in the audience heard of glyphosate? 2 people, okay. I'm looking for my water here. 2 people. Has anybody heard of Roundup? There you go. Because that's what's advertised on television. Roundup has an active ingredient called glyphosate. This was considered a miracle herbicide because it was considered to be safe for human beings, non-toxic to humans, only toxic to plants. It would kill every plant, but it was only toxic to plants. It is now the most commonly used herbicide on planet Earth. Supposedly it killed only plants, and glyphosate use is ubiquitous. I'm going to show you here on a chart this is the glyphosate use in the United States only from 1974 when it entered the market to 2014, 3 years ago. The green line on the bottom here is indicating private use. This is people spraying Roundup on their driveway or companies putting it around their parking lots. So this is non-agricultural use, and we've kind of leveled off at 25,000 thousands. These are increments of thousands. So that would be 2.5 million pounds, or 25 million pounds. As you climb up on agricultural use, this is the red line, we went from 0 in 1974 to 250,000 thousands, which is 250 million pounds of glyphosate used in 1 year in the United States. 250 million pounds. Now that's just the United States. It's used in many countries around the world. And they used it so extensively because, well, it's safe. It only kills plants. Well, there's a doctor that I've been studying the literature from who's named Dr. Stephanie Seneff. And she's determined, along with another group of scientists, it's not very safe at all. Okay? I've got some charts or some statistics. This is my recall on autism. Now this is a chart that she came up with. This is autism rates in the United States in 1970, 1 in 10,000. Last year, it was 1 in 50. Now, my recall is that 5 years ago was 1 in 360. 4 years ago was about 1 in 190. 3 years ago it was 1 in 106. 2 years ago it was 1 in 68. Last year was 1 in 50. Now, the current rate of growth for autism in the United States, by 2025, just up here on the graph, 8 years from now, 1 out of every 2 children will have autism. Now that should scare you. What is causing this? What is the driving factor? It turns out it is glyphosate. Glyphosate residues are in our food. They're in our concoctions that we make, in our farm animals. And it's so ubiquitous that we're all eating and drinking it all the time. I've got another article by Hannah Kincaid here. The actual title of the article is, "Are GMOs Toxic?" This is from Mother Earth News, and she was interviewing an engineer by the name of Thierry Vrain, who actually helped me come up with this chart right here. Now, the article's about GMOs, but GMOs we'll talk about in the next section, but GMOs are used because of glyphosate, primarily, because you can spray the crops with herbicide and not kill the crops, just the weeds. But anyway, here's what the article says. Monsanto's Roundup-ready crops are engineered to be herbicide resistant, specifically when sprayed with Roundup. Now that the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Arm has designated Roundup's active ingredient, glyphosate, as a probable carcinogenic substance to humans, consumers need to fully understand how the chemical works on plants and in turn impacts human health. For in-depth answers to these questions and more, we turn to molecular biologist and retired genetic engineer Thierry Vrain. She goes on to ask, when and why did you start researching glyphosate? I went to graduate school in North Carolina in the 1970s, where I was trained as a soil biologist, a nematologist to be precise. In school, I learned about agriculture and the damage caused by all sorts of pests and pathogens, such as nematodes, insects, and fungal diseases. I learned to deal with these pests by sterilizing soil and spraying pesticides. Glyphosate was invented as a descaling agent because it binds to all sorts of minerals and makes them unreactive, stripping them from the pipes. In biology and chemistry, we call this type of agent a chelator, and the binding of minerals is called chelating. Somebody promptly figured out that glyphosate kills all bacteria and plants, and there's a lot more money to be made using this chemical as an herbicide rather than as a descaling agent. How does glyphosate's chelating ability affect the way it interacts with plants? He goes on to say, well, unlike animals and humans, bacteria and plants make their own proteins because they're capable of synthesizing all 20 amino acids required as the building blocks of proteins. Bacteria and plants make 3 complex amino acids. We call them aromatic amino acids in a small biological or biochemical pathway called the shikimate pathway. One of the enzymes that the pathway is called is ESPS for short. ESPS is a protein with an atom of manganese that must be there for it to function properly. Manganese is a trace mineral, a metal. As a descaling agent, glyphosate enters the bacterial or plant cells and steals that atom of manganese from the EPSPS enzyme, rendering it unable to synthesize amino acids. If some of these building blocks are missing, the bacteria and plants can't synthesize the proteins and they promptly die. That means you've blocked the process of photosynthesis from working. The photosynthesis needs the manganese for the plant to take the sunlight and convert it into the proteins it needs to grow. In 2013, farmers in the United States used glyphosate-resistant soybeans on 93% of all planted soybean acreage, 85% of all corn acreage, 82% of all cotton acreage. These glyphosate-resistant crops are usually sprayed twice at the beginning of the crop cycle with 3/4 to 1.5 pounds, depending on the height of the plant, per acre. In recent years, many species of weeds have adapted and become resistant to glyphosate. Therefore, the use of glyphosate has to go up to kill the weeds. Now, he goes on to say that they use glyphosate now because they've learned as a chemical drying agent, it's very good. So when you're going to harvest your wheat or your rye or your oats, you spray your field with glyphosate, which is called a burn down technique, a few days before you're going to harvest, and it literally dries the plant right up. Have you noticed when your grass dries or flowers dry, it gets all crumbly? It dries out. Well, when glyphosate kills the plant, it dries up. Now, when you put your wheat or your rye or your oats in the barn or in a silo, they need to be dry or they'll mold. So they got this brainy idea, well, a couple days before we harvest, we'll spray the whole field with glyphosate and suck the moisture out of the grain. The only problem is the levels of glyphosate in the grain are going up and up and up. We know very little about the residual amounts of glyphosate in food crops for human consumption and animal consumption. What we do know is that the legal levels allowed by the EPA and Health Canada have increased significantly in the past few years, presumably to accommodate this new reality. The allowable levels are now well above parts per million. Every single crop has allowable levels. Sugar, they allow 10 parts per million. Soybeans and canola, 20 parts per million. Cereal grains, 30 parts per million. Non-grass animal feed for your cattle, your hogs, your chickens, 400 parts per million. These residue levels that were once considered extreme are now normal. A large number of published studies, mostly done outside the United States, show that as little as 1 part per million of glyphosate will kill almost all bacteria, particularly the beneficial bacteria in the gut of animals and people. In the gut of animals, that endocrine disruption of your hormones and the endocrine system, starts at 0.5 parts per million. And that just a few parts per million can cause oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, DNA damage, and many other disruptions in mammalian organs, organ cells, and tissues. Last year, the World Health Organization asked an international team of 17 senior toxicologists from 11 countries to review the status of several agricultural chemicals, including glyphosate. Their verdict in their literature is that it is quite possible a carcinogen. Recent scientific studies clearly show that glyphosate doesn't degrade easily in soil or in humans and animals, and a German study suggests that glyphosate accumulates in all organs: liver, kidneys, intestines, heart, lungs, bones, and so on, of animals and eating food products made with Roundup-ready crops. We have also known that for decades glyphosate is a powerful antibiotic, but it was only patented as one in 2010. I call glyphosate an antibiotic masquerading as a herbicide. Aside from its function as an endocrine disruptor and the multitude of other documented nefarious effects it has on human physiology, I think the most immediate concern is its damaging effect on the human microbiome. That's our gut. Do you know anybody with gut issues? It's going to be pretty common. It's glyphosate. Now, we could go into a lot of the technical reasons and how it does it in our gut. Some of it we'll be discussing as we go through the subject tonight. But you can see here, Jeffrey Vrain, who is now, theory of Vrain, who is now converted from a biologist with a chemical degree who works on genetically modified crops, is now an organic farmer because he sees the damage that it's doing. It's very unfortunate that we're so far down the road with these chemicals that it's very hard to back out. And that's why I think at some point in time, new farmland that hasn't been sprayed is going to be very important to us, because we do have a hungry world to feed. Well, now we're going to go to part 2, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Genetically modified organisms were really kind of a sideline or a product of glyphosate use, because scientists determined, those in agri-science, it would be great if you could raise crops and spray a herbicide that didn't hurt the crops. Well, they realized once they could figure out all these pathways that the herbicide works on, if we could put a gene in that was immune to that into our crops, whether it's corn or soy, we could then spray those crops with the herbicide, killing the weeds around them, but not the crop. That is called transgenic plants and animals. When you modify them, modify their genome, and transgenic is defined in the New American Dictionary this way: of or relating to or being an organism whose genome has been altered by the transfer of a gene or genes from another species or breed. They can be totally unrelated. Like I said earlier, 93% of our corn, according to this article in 2013, 93% of our soybeans, are genetically modified. 85% of all our corn is genetically modified. 82% of our cotton, 95% of our sugar beets. And the growing list of crops now includes potatoes, tomatoes, papaya, fruit trees, alfalfa, and coffee, among many others. Why modify a species or genome? Well, there's a false premise. We need to feed a hungry world. At population growths, we need to raise twice as much food on the same amount of land. The only problem is that's a false premise. The world is going to level off at between 9 and 10 million people. And according to statistics in the United States for last year, was the first year our life expectancy turned down. We're not going to keep living and longer and longer and longer with all these chemicals. Now, that whole idea of feeding a hungry world, I like coffee in the morning. There's hardly anything better than brewing a fresh cup of coffee. And I've been buying Kona coffee for years. Now, I'm not saying all Kona coffee, I have to be careful to say that, but this particular brand that I picked up, I've had before and really liked it. Smells great, looks great. I got it home, and on the back it says, may be produced with genetic engineering. I love coffee, but you don't need coffee to feed a hungry world. It's just not true. But these same people who spout these statistics that scare people, if we don't use the chemicals, if we don't use the glyphosate, if we don't genetically modify food, we're going to run out of food. It's not true. Being a farmer, I get the Michigan Farm News. Last year, we had a record corn crop. And in our Farm News, they give us our commodity supply and demand balance sheets every month that this comes out. The projections on the crop, on the yield, and then where it finishes out for the year. Title of the article here by Mr. Hilker, Dr. Jim Hilker, Unbelievable Corn and Soy Crops. I'm going to go through some of the statistics. This chart is broken down into many different categories, and it covers corn, wheat, and soybeans. Our total use of corn last year was 14,610 million bushel, which is 1.4 billion bushels. I should refer to my engineer friend. Is that 14 billion or 1.4 billion? 14 billion. That's what I thought. I was trying to do the mental cal. 14 billion bushels of corn. What we had left over at the end of the year was 2,403 billion bushels. In other words, almost 20% of the crop, 16.4% was left over. So it sounds like, okay, we got maybe a month and a half, 2 month extra supply here each year. Well, in 10 years you'd have way too much corn. What they don't tell you is ethanol for fuel that you burn in your car was 5.3 billion bushels. There's no shortage of food. We burn it in our cars. There's so much of it, we burn it in our cars. So you can see what's going on. The same thing with our wheat and our soybeans. Our wheat, we had so much last year, we ended up with 50% too much wheat. They don't know what to do with the wheat. Soy is also going up. Year by year, the leftover crop, what we have at the end of the year, after all the uses, we had 11.7% of the crop left over. That's just the United States. Brazil also raises a lot of these crops. Where's this idea that we're running out of food? We're not running out of food. It's everywhere. Farmers, anybody who's involved with farming knows it's pretty darn hard to make money farming. So what's the truth here? The truth is we don't need these chemicals. We don't need to grow more food. If we would use the food for what it was designed for, to eat, we have plenty. We have plenty. The sad part is, people don't realize now when they're eating something what it is they're eating. Here's what you get. When you're eating a potato, you may be eating something that's part rabbit. When you're eating a tomato, you may be eating something that's part fish or part shellfish. When you're eating corn or soy or sugar beets, you're eating a plant that has insecticide in it that gets in your stomach and upsets the bacteria in your stomach. Because you remember, glyphosate kills bacteria and plants. There's terrible negative effects that we're getting from this overload of chemicals in our food. Yet we keep doing it. So I want to refer to a couple of charts here now. When we genetically modify an animal or a plant, we're literally going into that double helix, the foundation of all life. We as humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and each chromosome is made up of DNA. Now this DNA, you've heard of the double helix, the coiled ladder, there's many descriptions of it. This double helix is what forms or has all the information to pass on to the next generation of that plant or animal. The human body has so much DNA in it that there's 60 trillion kilometers, which is enough to go from here to the moon and back 8,000 times. That's a lot of information in the human body. Now when you take out of that long coil of DNA, you take one section out that we could call a gene, a specific gene. A gene looks like this when you describe it. And I got these charts. I should credit the book Farmageddon, written by Brewster Neen. I modified these charts, but this information and the basic idea of it came from him. He wrote the book Farmageddon back in the late 90s. You have one gene composed of DNA, and at each end of it, you've got the information here. At each end, there's a segment of that gene that does a job. One end is a promoter, the other end is a signal. Now, if in the chromosomes and the genes your mother or father, say, has blue eyes, and if that's dominant in the case that we're talking about here, the promoter would say, turn on the gene for blue eyes for this baby. Signals the gene to turn that on. That portion of the DNA gets passed on to the next generation. That baby has blue eyes. That's just a simple way of showing how the gene works. You've got trillions of these things in your body. If you've got 60 trillion miles of DNA, these are unimaginable numbers we're talking about here. So the regulator is controlling, like a flag, what's happening, like a signal flag, and this other end is a switch, a signal switch. Turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. And that's what forms us to be the individuals we are, but also the species that we are. DNA is the universal building blocks of life. Everything has it in it. All plants, all animals have DNA. So to be a human and not a dog or a stalk of corn, it has to select the particular order of the data that forms the genes in the genome to produce that animal, that creature, that plant. That's why DNA is called the universal code of life. Now I have it described here very well. If I can find it. Right here. This is a book I highly recommend, Seeds of Deception by Jeffrey Smith. And he explains DNA very well. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, is found inside the nucleus of every cell. It is complex. We're talking really complex. Molecule with billions of atoms tightly wrapped in a double helix formation. Picture a twisted ladder, like we have there. If uncoiled, a single DNA molecule, can you imagine how small that is? A single DNA molecule would stretch 10 feet. Unbelievable. DNA has been compared to a supercomputer, a blueprint, and a central switchboard. In ways that are still largely a mystery, DNA tells the cell how to behave and carries information that is passed from generation to generation. Just as computer software is based on a simple code of ones and zeros, DNA software is made up of 4 recurring units called nucleotides, or bases, arranged in pairs. And like software, it is a sequence of these units that carries the information. Every cellular organism has DNA, although it differs in size, content, and complexity. Human DNA has 3 billion base pairs. Incredible numbers we're talking about here. So when they decide that they're going to change a plant or an animal just so that we can spray it with a herbicide, what do? Well, you got to hand it to man. He's pretty ingenious. Now, this is the old style. It's only been done for like the last 20 or so years. But I'll show you the new style in just a moment. This also comes from that book, Farmageddon. I title it, How to Try to Outsmart God. You see, you have a tomato. Tomatoes freeze at 32 degrees and it ruins the crop. So you want to have tomatoes that are firm for shipping and won't freeze at 32 degrees. So we'll start with the example of a fish. You take a flounder fish that doesn't freeze at 32 degrees. You find the gene in its genome that produces the antifreeze in the fish. And you put that gene onto a bacterial plasmid. Then you take a virus. And a virus replicates itself by taking over the nucleus of cells in our body or the body of a plant or an animal. You take a virus with the control mechanism and you put it into the bacterial plasmid. Now you have a bacterial plasmid that has a control feature that can take over the living thing you put it into and the trait you want. And you replicate it so that you get perhaps millions of them. and you put it into a gene gun, take a segment of DNA from the genome of whatever it is you're trying to modify, in this case a tomato, and you fire that gene gun through the tomato DNA until some of these plasmids stick. Then the virus will take over the tomato portion of DNA that it's conquering the nucleus for, and it will reproduce that fish characteristic in the tomato. Now you have a tomato that won't freeze at 32 degrees. If you do the same thing with shellfish genes, the gene that makes a lobster hard or a clam hard, whatever shellfish you're trying to talk about, and you put that into the tomato doing the same technique, you now have a tomato that won't freeze until it's 28 degrees, but it's hard like a baseball. You can ship it thousands of miles. When I was a boy, my mom and dad would have us handle the tomatoes so carefully because they would bruise. You know, you placed them in a bag just like eggs. You had to handle them carefully. Now you could throw them around, drop them on the floor, eat them, they taste like cardboard, feel like cardboard. But young people, unless you've had organic tomatoes, don't know the difference. They think that's what tomatoes have always been like. No, they haven't. They've been modified. Now, what's the problem with that? What's the effect? Well, if you're allergic to shellfish, which a major portion of our population is, I'm not saying a majority, but a large part, you're now allergic to tomatoes. Sound like there's a problem developing here? There's people allergic to the cotton in their shirts, people allergic to all kinds of things now. You go, where's all these allergies coming from? Well, it's genetic modification combined with the glyphosate use. That's where we've gotten to. Now this is old style, even though it's only been around a couple of decades. This is what we've modified our corn and our soybeans and our beets with. But now this is a 4-year-old system out there called CRISPR. And CRISPR is a technique in which they can literally, with very, very sophisticated tools, go into the double helix, find the part with the trait they want to change, and literally snip it out. And take the trait from whatever animal or plant they want and put it in there. It's done very rapidly now. So now they're modifying all kinds of things. But where is this going to lead to? What's it going to lead to? A totally different world. A totally different world in which sunlight's not going to act the way it should on plants and animals. Food isn't digestible the way it should be. Cross species are trading diseases back and forth. You see, bacteria, and scientists know this, bacteria and virus trade information all the time. That's why they got to come up with a new flu vaccine every year. That's why we keep getting the cold over and over again. Bacteria and viruses keep changing so they can attack us. And they trade the information when they're successful to the next generation of bacteria, the next virus generation. Well, we don't know what we're doing when we're messing around with what diseases a pig may get, or a chicken may get, or a tree may get, when we introduce it into the human genome or another plant. So diseases are starting to cross barriers that were never crossed before. You know, you can take a potato and a rabbit and sit it next to each other in a cage and go back and check it as often as you want. You will never see them mate. Guaranteed. But when you use one of these techniques, either CRISPR or the gene gun, you can make a potato that's part rabbit. Our body doesn't know what to do with the potato that's part rabbit. Now, there's a Dr. Arvid Pusztai from England who determined that modified potatoes lead to colon cancer. We are playing with things that we have no idea where it's going to end up. And we're doing it because we can, and because we think we're going to make money from it. The EPA now is telling farmers bugs are adapting to glyphosate, and bugs are adapting to genetically modified corn. So what do they do to make corn modified? Well, we'll take an example here. A little bit of different example, but very much the same. Corn, you want to spray glyphosate on and kill the weeds, but not the corn. But you also are having problems with pests, like corn borers. Okay? So, why don't we change the stalk of corn so that it produces the same insecticide that kills the corn borer in nature? Well, they searched the world over, and they found in the ground is a bacteria called Bt for short, which is Bacteria thuringiensis. And Bacteria thuringiensis is throughout the soil. It's why we don't get this deep in insects by the end of the summer. It eats insects. It eats their larvae. But it does it by injecting an insecticide and killing it, and then it devours it. Well, there's a gene in that bacteria that produces that insecticide, which is very potent. So you've probably heard of Roundup Ready corn. Well, there's Bt corn. You take the Bt gene, put it into the genome of the corn plant, and then every cell of that corn plant produces that insecticide that used to be only in a bacteria. Now, when the corn borer bites that corn, it dies. Okay? Bt in potatoes does the same thing. In beets does the same thing. So they're putting Bt in everything. That's an exaggeration, but lots of crops. Well, the insects in the ground are finding it so ubiquitous that they're learning how to beat the Bt. That's why this article said the government is starting to warn farmers not to plant the same crop year after year in the same soil and to leave residual places with normal corn, so there's places that the bug can't get tricked or trick the insecticide. Because once that bug figures out how to beat Bt, what's going to happen with the insects out in society? Have you created a Frankenstein monster? They might be small, but by the trillions and trillions and trillions, it could be awful. So this is what they're doing, and they're realizing as they go along, oh, we never thought that would happen. We didn't think they'd get immunity to it. We didn't think there'd be super weeds. We didn't think there'd be super bugs. We didn't think it would upset people's guts so they get Crohn's disease and colitis and all these various gut issues like leaky gut and allergies. But they're not telling us. It's people like Dr. Seneff and Thierry Vrain and Don Huber. There's a whole list of Jeffrey Smith, of people out there who are trying to tell us we're destroying ourselves. Now the world is getting attention because the naturalists of the world are noticing, hey, the wildlife's disappearing. Rachel Carson back in the early 60s warned us, silent spring. Do you want to get up in the spring morning, go outside, stand in the sun and hear nothing? Dead silence? Do you want to go sit on the porch at night and don't hear any crickets? Don't hear frogs? Don't hear cicadas? That's what a mass extinction is. Well, when that kind of mass extinction takes place, we're next. It's already happening. You know, you can try to solve the world's problems by bringing all the jobs home. I'm not trying to get political here, but bring the jobs home, build walls, whatever you want to do to fix the economy the way you think it needs to be fixed. But you know what? If we're all sick, it's not going to matter. If half of our children get autism, if half of us get cancer, if half of us get heart disease, and these are about approximate numbers, if half of us get diabetes eventually, which we're getting close to that now, it doesn't matter. Protect your country. You're all sick and dying. Don't talk about the health care bills and getting rid of Obamacare. There's no way we can pay enough premiums. And there won't be enough caregivers anyway. So we really are facing a mass extinction that we've got to do something about. That brings me to the last section. In order to fight all these diseases we're creating, We're inventing all kinds of antibiotics, more and more powerful antibiotics. Well, we'll cure these gut issues. We'll cure the superbugs, the MRSAs and the staph and the super staph. The only problem is we can't keep up with them because the bacteria are learning how to beat all those drugs too. Science has outsmarted itself. And we've gotten to the point now the drugs are losing. The bugs are winning. Whether it's the insects, the superweeds, or disease, bacteria, the bugs are winning. And we are going to lose this fight unless we turn to God and start doing things the right way. Because the earth can fix itself. God designed it that way. You know, the hormones and the antibiotics that we're using to try to fix all these ailments, and in some cases the hormones and antibiotics are just to make more food, believe it or not. Actually, more hormones and antibiotics get used in agriculture than through your doctor. It's a given. And they're endocrine disruptors. They're upsetting our bodily systems. This amazing body that God made, it's so incredible. We have a skeletal structure, muscular structure, circulatory, a nervous system, the lymphatic system, the immune system, the endocrine system, and they all work together in harmony. God's the one who made it that way. God did that. I'm going to turn to the book of Genesis. Then God said, this is Genesis 1, verse 11, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit, according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed, according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God created the animals, and He said they will reproduce after their own kind. He created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, and with the waters and with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. The animals, the birds, the sea creatures, the plants, they all produce after their kind. And they all work together because God designed it that way. And look what we're doing. We have no clue where all this is going to go. But people who know and care realize it's going to be a bad place. And it may be irreversible. Because once you've tampered with the seed germ, the actual reproductive part of the plant or animal, it will take that trait and reproduce it forever. And what have you created? We don't know. And how do you get back to square one? We don't know. So we are playing with some very, very dangerous things here. Then God said in verse 26, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. Then He blessed them, and He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." When God made Adamic man, He made him to reproduce after His own kind as well. And we were made in His image and likeness. The marvelous systems that God put in us, our skeletal, circulatory, nervous, and what have you, work together, and it's hormones working with the genome that tells it what to do. When you start messing up the genome and the hormones, your system doesn't know what to do anymore. Your gut lets things out that should never have been let out. Things happen to your heart, your brain. I could go on and on. We don't have time tonight. But the linkages to what we have done in agriculture strongly correlate to the Alzheimer's epidemic, the ALS problems that are growing, the autism, the cancer, the neurological disorders, the mental illness. It all correlates. because we've messed the things up that have worked by God's design to work well to keep us healthy. It's interesting that we're made of dirt. Dirt is full of minerals, full of the things that we need to live, combined with water and air. When you use glyphosate and other chemicals that are chelators, and they take the minerals out or put them in the wrong place, you've totally messed up the human body. Then when you go to the doctor and you say, I'm sick, I've got gut issues, I've got arthritis, I've got this, I've got that, they give you drugs to treat the symptom, you're only getting worse. You haven't gone back to the problem. You haven't gone back to the issue that we're ruining the earth. We're no longer stewards of what God gave us. A hormone, according to the New American Heritage Dictionary, is a substance, usually a peptide or a steroid, produced by one tissue and conveyed by the bloodstream to another to affect physiological activity such as growth or metabolism. A synthetic compound, this is a secondary definition, a synthetic compound that acts like a hormone in the human body, or plant, or animal, or any of various substances found in plants and insects that regulate development. That's what hormones do. They regulate how we grow, what your body calls for nutrition, minerals, and it's tied to your immune system. Your immune system is the integrated body system of organs, tissues, and cells, and cell products such as antibiotics that we produce ourselves that differentiate between self and non-self and neutralize potentially pathogenic organisms and substances. Well, when we make an antibiotic within ourselves, naturally, it differentiates between us and the enemy, the germ. When we ingest chemicals that move the minerals around, that jerk around our genes and our DNA, all of a sudden, our body thinks we're the enemy. And autoimmune disorders are just skyrocketing everywhere. And we treat them with emoluments and concoctions and more drugs. Yeah, we were wonderfully and fearfully made in the image of God. And God has qualities we can relate to. He has intellect. He has emotions. He has energy. He has power. He has creativity. He has life inherent within himself. We can identify with those things. But unlike us, God doesn't need hormones to regulate any of that stuff, because he's made of spiritual substance. But he designed the human body by pulling that dirt together to reflect those intangibles by the use of physical things. So, when you have gut issues that affect the mind, and you're depressed, or you get bipolar, or whatever, it's the mess up of the hormones in the human body through these artificial means that have now messed up your emotions. So kids are getting uncontrollable, kids are getting autistic, people are getting to be allergic to all kinds of food. But their body is telling them, your body is my enemy. Your own immune system is attacking yourself. Our body needs to be able to express its emotions, its sexuality, its creativity, its energy, and its health with the use of hormones, working with our genome the way God designed it. And then it needs to defend that body with the immune system the way God designed it. And out there on the earth somewhere, God has put things to help us. They're finding more and more natural things all the time that don't do any of these things to our genome, but will help us stay healthy. That's where we should focus on where we want to go as a world. Because this stuff here is only going to lead us to a very, very bad place, and very quickly, very, very quickly. All that we are is under assault with the chemicals, the genetic modifications, and the hormone disruptions. All animals and plants use their genome and their hormones to express what they are. I don't care if it's a dog or a cat or a cow or a plant or a tree. It uses these things in the same building blocks of life to express what it is. But we were the creatures made in the image and likeness of God, so we can reason, we can communicate, we can invent. Well, we can go off in the wrong direction too, which is what we've done. Now, unfortunately, we feed our cattle antibiotics by the truckload. And we also feed them hormones, so they get big fast. But we eat all that stuff. We need to go back to a system where farming is really about animal husbandry and stewardship of the land. So I've got a couple of quotes that I'd like to bring in at this point here without overkill, but like I say, we could go on all night with all these things. I will end up on a happy note, I assure you. But here's an article from Mother Earth News, Roundup Kills More Than Weeds. To protect our health, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency sets maximum legal residual levels for every pesticide for dozens of crops. But a new study in the respected journal Toxicology has shown that at low levels that are currently legal in our food, Roundup could cause DNA damage. So not only is it leading to gut issues and stripping us of minerals, it does DNA damage. It's also an endocrine disruptor that leads to cell death. The potential real-life risks of this are infertility, low sperm count, and prostate or testicular cancer. But the symptoms could be so subtle that it would be easy to overlook, says Theo Colburn, president of the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. Timing is of critical importance. If a pregnant woman were exposed to in early gestation, it looks like these herbicides could have an effect on the sexual differentiation stage of the fetus. This is really shocking because it affects the testosterone levels in boys and the estrogen levels in girls. Are we not dealing with all kinds of issues like that today? Well, the Caratech Health Report covers the use of soy and soy products, which soy is in almost everything. Just read labels, it's amazing. The title of this article is Mean Beans, the scary truth about soy. The following information was presented to the FDA by Dr. Mike Fitzpatrick of New Zealand in an effort to prevent the agency from including soy isoflavones on the generally regarded as safe list, abbreviated for GRAS, G-R-A-S as short, a list of ingredients in food and additives and medicines that are considered safe. And here's why. Soy formula, which contains phytoestrogens, genistein and diazinon, also called isoflavones, is given to approximately 25% of U.S. children in infant formula. It is estimated that an infant fed exclusively soy formula receives the estrogenic equivalent of at least 5 birth control pills per day. A recent study found that babies fed soy-based formulas had 13,000 to 22,000 times more isoflavones in their blood than babies fed with milk-based formula. Scientists have known for years that isoflavones in soy products depress the thyroid function, causing autoimmune thyroid disease and even cancer of the thyroid. But what are the effects of soy products on the hormonal development of the infant, both male and female? Male infants undergo a testosterone surge during the first few months of life, when testosterone levels may be as high as those of an adult male. During this period, the infant is programmed to express male characteristics after puberty, but not only in the development of his sexual organs and other masculine physical traits, but also in setting patterns in the brain characteristic of male behavior. So in the very first weeks and months of life, testosterone levels are supposed to go way up in baby boys, and it tells the brain and the body, you're a boy. Act like a boy. But when they're full of soy products, they're full of endocrine disruptors and hormones, that all gets out of whack. And that critical early portion of life where the brain and all this beautiful mechanism God put together tells you, I'm a boy, it's all messed up. There's an article written in the same publication in 1993, which I won't take the time to read, that warned us that the hormones that were coming into our food supply were going to affect us in the next generation. That's coming true. So we're literally messing up everything. Why? We don't want to go back to the original Creator and say, how is it that we should live? How is it that we should live? Well, let's go to Exodus. Exodus chapter 20. I'm focusing on 3 of the commandments here. You shall not murder, the 6th commandment. You shall not steal, the 8th commandment. And you shall not bear false witness to your neighbor, the 9th commandment. Now, these were written 3,500 years ago to tell us how to have human relations. If we ignore them, there's a penalty to be paid. And if we don't tell people the truth about what we're doing, we're bearing false witness. And if we're producing food that makes them sick, it is in essence murder, if we know that it's causing sickness and death. If we do it for greedy purposes to make money, we're stealing from them. So we have to ask ourselves, and specifically on the subject today, farmers and people involved with agribusiness, am I my brother's keeper? What am I supposed to do in this whole thing? And as they learn more, they're going to become responsible. I think there's a test coming on us at the end of the age, which I think will lead to wonderful things, but it's when we come face to face with what we've done and say we're not going to do this anymore and we're going to go back to God's law, I believe then we're going to start fixing things. But if you go to Romans chapter 13 and verse 8, owe no one anything except love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Well, we're faced with a test here at the end of the age, and I think God didn't cause it, but of course He knew it was going to happen. And that test is, are we going to go back and respect the way He made things? Are we going to respect His laws? Are we going to be stewards of the earth? And are we going to care for our fellow man? That's the test. Revelation 3 says that this test will come upon the whole earth. And if we don't pass the test with enough of us, the earth is finished. But Jesus Christ in Revelation says in chapter 7, we will pass the test. Many of us from every nation, kindred, tongue, and people are going to pass this test. I believe it's our job right now to get this word out, because most people don't realize they're involved in this test right now. They're involved in this trial. But when they start to realize, my birds are dying, my dog is sick, my kids are sick, my grandkids are sick. We're talking about our children and grandchildren here. Do we want half of them autistic in a few years? We've got to do something. And I believe this will be the catalyst for good. Because people are going to realize, look, let's go back and do things in a sane way, the way our Creator designed things to work. He made us in His image and likeness because He loves us. He wants us to love each other and the earth. And when He gave us that curse in Genesis 3, that it'll be hard to produce food, because of the fall in the garden. It'll be hard to produce food. You'll have to fight off the weeds and work by the sweat of your brow. That was to teach us a lesson, to do it the right way. You see, God is in essence farming us. We're His soil. Jesus Christ plants the seed in us, and He wants us to bear fruit of love and kindness and compassion toward our fellow man. And God literally is a spiritual farmer. I could go through the scriptures. If you want to look them up in James 5 and Isaiah 55, maybe I'll go ahead and read a little bit in conclusion here. Isaiah 55, starting in verse 8, says, this is God speaking, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, nor your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This isn't God's ways. He made it so like produces like, and He said that's good. Kind produces kind. And He protected us from the diseases of various species because of that. And He said that's good. Verse 10, "For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth and make it bring forth and bud, then it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it." And that rain that comes down from heaven is God's word, the former and the latter rain, the Old and the New Testament. "You shall go out with joy and be led out with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth into singing before you, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress tree, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. And it shall be to the Lord for a name, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off." God is farming the earth, and we're the soil that He's working in. And He says, my word is the rain that should make the seed grow. And so when you do, the crops that I want you to have are love, joy, peace, happiness, and not the thorns and the briars of life. And that's what we learn when we pull the weeds out of our garden and we help the plants grow. We're learning that that's what God wants me to do in my life. And one of the ways we can do that the best is loving our fellow man. We are our brother's keeper. The sooner we learn this, the better. So that's why we're doing these presentations. There will be more to follow. If you're interested, there's a paper there. I can't come down here as often as I'd like, but we can certainly send you the DVDs when they're ready or any other information you want. So if you want to let us know what your address is, we'll be glad to send it to you. But that is the test that we have. I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you find this both interesting and profitable in your own life. So once again, thank you for coming. I'll take any questions if you have some questions. Yes, sir?
When would you say the start, that we humans went down this road? I mean, what was the start? Obviously, it's been increasing a lot more recently, but Rachel Carson wrote about this in the 1960s. Where did she trace the start of this to?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, when did we start going down this road? And I'll take it you're talking about the modern road. You know, mankind has always been trying to beat this curse of how hard it is to grow food, but there wasn't much they could do about it. I mean, they little inventions, the moldboard plow, and you know, the fact that if you keep the ground fertile and use composting, there's things you can do to help. But that's all within the natural realm. But Rachel Carson noticed that really in the 1940s is when it started getting serious. The 1940s, World War II was just ending, and in World War II, our soldiers were having a terrible problem overseas with getting lice and other various, varmints and bugs and whatnot. And DDT came along. And they would literally spray our soldiers, spray their camps, and when the war ended, they said, hey, this stuff worked great, you know. So they started spraying mosquitoes and whatnot. As a matter of fact, down here in the south, a little further south than this, Mississippi and Georgia and stuff, to get rid of the mosquitoes and whatnot, They sprayed, I think in the late 40s, early 50s, 20 million acres to see if they could eradicate these things. And from what I was reading, the stench of rotting flesh in the woods was horrible for months after they sprayed, because the animals all died. That should have told us something right there. But it wasn't until the 1960 book by her that we really woke up, that it was a bestseller, runaway bestseller. People started realizing, wait a minute, everything really is dying around us. But we didn't know how bad it was for people yet. That came along a little later in the 60s and 70s. But Rachel realized that, okay, we are next. We are not immune to this stuff. Unfortunately, believe it or not, she died of breast cancer herself 2 years after she published the book. But people were getting exposed heavily back then. So they banned DDT. They came out with glyphosate, atrazine, a whole list of chemicals. So good question. So it really started in earnest in the 1940s. Well, thank you for coming. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.